Welcome to Personality Development, the channel where we break down the science of who you are and how to grow into your best self. If you want practical psychology that helps you understand yourself, others, and how to change for the better, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe and the bell so you don't miss future lessons. In today's first session, we'll unpack what psychology is, why it's a science, the goals psychologists aim for, and the major approaches from Wundt to modern biological and cognitive science. By the end, you'll see how these ideas connect directly to personality development. Objective of this session: define psychology clearly. Understand its scientific methods and goals. Learn the main schools of thought and how they explain behavior and personality. Let's start with a simple definition. Psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Behavior equals anything an organism does that you can observe: talking, walking, facial expressions. Mental processes equals internal experiences we infer from behavior: thoughts, feelings, memories, attention. Psychology sits between biology, the brain, and the social world. It tries to explain how mind and environment interact. Goals of psychology. Psychology has 4 classic goals: describe, explain, predict, and control behavior. Describe means observe behavior and report facts. Example: a therapist notes the frequency of social withdrawal. Explain indicates identifying causes and mechanisms. Example: linking social anxiety to negative beliefs about rejection. Predict means to anticipate future behavior based on patterns. Example: low sleep predicts poor impulse control the next day. Control, or influence, means use knowledge to change behavior in helpful ways. Example: applying CBT techniques to reduce panic attacks. Psychology as a science. Why call psychology a science? Because it uses systematic empirical methods to study behavior and mind. As psychology is understood through empirical methods: objective observation, replication, and prediction. Empirical methods. Psychologists rely on data gathered from experiments, controlled observations, surveys, longitudinal studies, and case studies. The emphasis is on evidence gathered from observation and measurement rather than pure opinion. Objective observation/operationalization. To be scientific, we define variables clearly so others can measure them. Stress becomes measurable via a scale, heart rate, or cortisol level. Good science reduces subjectivity by using consistent definitions and reliable instruments. Replication and prediction. A scientific claim is stronger if other researchers can reproduce the result. Psychology aims to predict behavior reliably, e.g., people who ruminate are more likely to experience depression. Replication builds confidence. Failure to replicate leads to refining theories and methods. Ethics and controls. Psychological science includes ethical safeguards, informed consent, confidentiality, and control techniques, random assignment, control groups, to isolate causal effects. Major approaches to psychology. Structuralism. The main contributors include Wundt and Titchener. Structuralism is one of the earliest scientific attempts. Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener asked, "What are the basic elements of conscious experience?" This approach focuses on breaking consciousness into basic elements: sensations, feelings, images. A major method used is introspection, wherein a trained individuals report the contents of their consciousness in response to stimuli. Example: reporting the basic sensations when tasting an apple. Major contribution includes introduced experimental methods to the study of the mind by Wundt's lab, and the approach is criticized as introspection is subjective and varies between people, not a reliable method for all psychological questions. Structuralism helped establish psychology as an experimental science as a foundation for later, more reliable approaches. Functionalism was popularized by William James. Functionalism was reaction to structuralism. William James asked, "What does consciousness do?" The emphasis is on function and adaptation. The approach focused on how mental processes help organisms adapt to the environment, stream of consciousness, habits. The functionalism is very broad pragmatic approach, as it has studied thinking, learning, emotion as processes that serve survival and adaptation. Example: attention helps you prioritize important stimuli in a busy environment. Functionalism emphasized applied psychology and individual differences, influenced educational and clinical psychology, and it is criticized due to less experimental rigor in early forms. More descriptive. Functionalism's idea of habits and adaptive behavior informs how personality traits help or hinder functioning. The third behaviorism was popularized by Watson and Skinner. Behaviorism dominated early 20th century psychology, focused on we should study only observable behavior. Emphasis was on observable behavior, not intermental life. And learning through conditioning, classical conditioning by Pavlov, focused on learning by association. Operant conditioning by Skinner focused on behavior shaped by reinforcement and punishment. Examples: a child afraid of dogs after being bitten is an example for classical conditioning, and a rewarding study behavior with praise increases study frequency is example of operant conditioning. The strengths of the behaviorism lays on powerful, testable techniques to change behavior, such as behavioral therapies, habit formation. And the limitations are neglects internal thought processes, emotions, and biological factors. Behaviorists explain personality as learned patterns of response shaped by reinforcement histories, useful for behavior change work such as habits and phobias. Next approach is Gestalt psychology, popularized by Kohler, Kafka. Gestalt psychology focuses on perception as the whole is different from the sum of its parts. The focus is on perception organizes sensory input into meaningful wholes using principles like figure ground, proximity, similarity, closure, and continuity, and emphasizes insight and problem-solving rather than step-by-step conditioning. Example: you perceive a face in a few lines because the brain organizes features into a whole. Major contributions include deep insights into perception and cognition, influenced modern cognitive psychology. The limitation: more descriptive principles than a unified experimental program for all mental life. Gestalt helps explain how people organize experiences and how that shapes interpretation, important for understanding biases and meaning-making. Psychoanalysis, or psychodynamic, by Sigmund Freud. The approach's main contribution includes psychoanalysis, emphasizing the unconscious mind, early experiences, and inner conflict. The approach tries to explain much of mental as function of unconscious drives, wishes, and memories shape behavior, and personality development shaped by psychosexual stages and conflicts between id, ego, and superego. The techniques popularized by psychoanalysis include free association, dream analysis, and interpretation of defense mechanisms. Examples: defense mechanisms, repression, projection, transference, and therapy. The strengths includes introduce the importance of early experience, unconscious motives, and talk therapy. And criticism. Freud's claims are difficult to test scientifically, rely on case studies, and can be culturally biased. The psychodynamic therapies evolved into more empirically grounded relational and attachment-focused therapies. Psychoanalytic ideas still influence how we think about internal conflicts, childhood influences, and defense mechanisms in personality. Humanistic psychology was popularized by Maslow and Rogers. Humanistic psychology emerged as a third force, a positive, person-centered alternative. Maslow emphasized on free will, personal growth, meaning, and self-actualization, whereas Carl Rogers postulated unconditional positive regard in client-centered therapy. Abraham Maslow's major work of hierarchy of needs, culminating in self-actualization, and therapy focuses on empathy and helping clients realize their potential rather than diagnosing them. Strengths of the approach are optimistic focus, emphasis on subjective experience and dignity. Valuable in coaching and personal development, whereas the limitations include harder to measure scientifically, can be overly idealistic without detailed mechanisms. The approaches are strongly used in personal growth, motivational work, and counseling central to personality development strategies. Cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology studies mental processes like thinking, memory, language, problem solving, and attention. Think of the mind as an information processing system. The focus on internal processes that were neglected by behaviorism, such as study of schemas, working memory, long-term memory, mental models, and cognitive biases. The major methods include experiments, reaction time measures, neuroimaging, and computational models. The strengths include precise experimental paradigms, fertile integration with neuroscience, whereas the limitations are as the approach is criticized for treating the mind like a computer and ignoring social/emotional context. Cognitive models explain how thought patterns create stable personality tendencies, example optimistic versus pessimistic explanatory style, and inform cognitive behavioral techniques for personality change. Biological and evolutionary approaches. Biological psychology looks at the brain, genes, hormones, and nervous system. Evolutionary psychology asks how psychological traits evolved to solve adaptive problems. The key idea of biological approach is that it links behavior to brain structures, amygdala for fear, neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, and genetics, heritability studies. Methods. fMRI, EEG, pharmacology, twin/adoption studies. The evolutionary approach explains universal psychological mechanisms as adaptations, e.g., fear of snakes because it had survival value. Example of biological approach is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors affecting serotonin to treat depression. And an example of evolutionary approach is mate preferences shaped by reproductive challenges. The strengths of the approach are offers mechanistic explanations and links to medicine, powerful predictive models. Whereas the limitation includes evolutionary explanations can be speculative if not carefully tested. Biological reductionism can ignore environment and culture. Biology helps explain temperament, genetic predispositions, and neurochemical influences on traits like impulsivity or anxiety. Evolutionary insights clarify why certain patterns like risk, aversion, etc. Integrative perspective. Modern psychology is eclectic as researchers borrow methods and ideas from multiple approaches. For a practical personality development program, we combine insights like use behavioral techniques for habit change, reinforcement, use cognitive tools to reframe unhelpful thoughts, use humanistic practices for meaning and motivation. Consider biological factors like sleep, nutrition, and stress. Be mindful of developmental and social contexts. Example nightly routine as behavioral, thought record for negative thinking as cognitive, plus values clarification as humanistic, and check sleep/hormones as biological base. Quick recap. Psychology is scientific study of behavior and mental processes. The 4 goals of psychology are describe, explain, predict, control. Psychology is a science, as it uses empirical methods, objective measures, replication, and ethical controls. The major approaches each give a different lens that includes structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, gestalt, psychoanalysis, humanistic, cognitive, biological/evolutionary.